Well, Glenn Carle is a former officer of the CIA and author. He joins us now from Boston. Glenn, thank you so much for joining us here at TRT World. Now, one of the suspects said he was involved in building of an intelligence network here in Turkey. So is this standard activity, intelligence activity, or is there something else here?
Well, the answer to both questions is that it's both things are happening. It is standard operating procedure. Of course, we all know, or should, that intelligence officers operate really everywhere, particularly where vital national interests are. So the UAE is not a global service, but it certainly will be active where its political masters have strategic interests, and Turkey is one. So that's not a surprise. Now, could something more than routine intelligence be going on? The answer to that is also yes, given the Khashoggi issue and the changing balances of power and struggles for influence and power in the Middle East, among, in particular, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia. So both things are happening, sure.
Mm-hmm. Now, one suspect said, quote, "We wanted to create an anti-Turkey team." How serious of a security threat was this for Turkey?
Well, I don't know if I'd use the term security threat. Security threat to me evokes or calls to mind actual physical threats to blood and treasure in Turkey or elsewhere. That's conceivable, but I think highly unlikely. More likely is that this is intelligence work to be used to promote the UAE's foreign policies, which will mean Saudi Arabia's also, and to undermine steps that Turkey might be trying to take, or at least, at the very least, to be aware of what is going on in Turkey that affects UAE interests and to potentially be able to take steps about them. So that's what's going on more, I think, than a direct physical kind of threat at this point.
So you think this should be looked at also in the wider context of worsening relations between the UAE and Turkey?
Well, if not worsening relations, certainly rivalry and struggle for influence and advantage. You know, intelligence work is always to seek an advantage, and the first thing one has to accomplish is to know what the other side is doing, and that gives you the potential possibility of countering it. So, at the least, that is happening. This is, I'm afraid, a dark world where this is not surprising and pretty standard.
Glenn, you are a former intelligence officer. Now, how do you see this playing out now, and what do you think Turkey will do next?
Well, I'm a little surprised that Turkey has detained these two people. I mean, that's an open step that indicates a counter move. The more typical position or response at first is to always want to learn what other powers are doing. So for the Turkish service to become aware of who these officers are and then what their network is, and then to observe it clandestinely. It's better, generally speaking, that the other side not know what you know or what you're doing. The fact that they were arrested and this has been publicized, now this has become a political tool and lever. The end game is beyond anyone to predict. At this point, there are too many variables at play at one time. But it's a struggle for influence in the Middle East, and specifically Syria right now, and that will affect the Kurds, which affects the Turks, which affects the relations with Qatar and Israel and so on. So it's part of the great game of the Middle East. What exactly Erdogan seeks by making this public now, at the least, to shut down and counter the UAE and Saudi actions of this sort in Turkey for the moment. Beyond that, I'm not certain.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Glenn Carle, thanks so much for joining us. He's a former CIA officer and author. Thanks so much for your time for TRT World.